If I could be a half something, what would I want my lower half to be?
Mermaid, no question.
Oh, yeah?
Easy
Okay.
answer.
So you've thought about this before. Are you
course.
also a mermaid, PJ?
Actually, I think I'd be a bird.
Yeah,
Oh, one's
bird,
fly.
bird or
I don't want to
fish.
fly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Well,
fly.
I want to be a ring-tailed lemur on the bottom.
Hello, everyone. I'm PJ Manny, and this is Love Letters to the Future. And with me today is my co-host.
Laura Faye Tenenbaum. Hi, nice to see you all.
Today we have a really important guest in what I'm calling the Toolkit series for storytellers of all kinds on how to tell stories in our new Mythos framework that really speak to larger audiences and future stories. Gail Carriger. Gail has multiple New York Times bestsellers and millions of books in print in dozens of different languages. Gail, how many books do you have published now?
I would say between 35 and 40, somewhere in there.
I love you're at the point where you've now lost track. I love that. She writes, as she puts it, book hugs, comedies of manners mixed with steampunk, urban fantasy, or sci-fi, and cozy queer joy as G.L. Carriger. She's best known for the Parasol Protectorate and Finishing School series. She was once an archaeologist, which is going to come in very handy in our conversation today, and is fond of shoes, octopuses, and tea.
Well, who isn't?
Gail, welcome. We're really incredibly thrilled to have you today.
Apologies, everybody, if you hear road noise. I live in a very busy street and my microphone isn't awesome.
You are awesome, so you're making up for it.
When I talk about the Toolkit series, I'm talking about previous guests like Nisi Shawl, Henry Leanne, Greg Dember, people who can help both storytellers and story audiences recognize forms of story that may be better, more effective, more heartfelt, reach more audience members than we've been previously taught. I know this because I took Gail's class through Nisi Shaw's Writing the Other, and I also read her phenomenal book, The Heroine's Journey, which is a fantastic workbook for every kind of writer. One more preface. So I worked in Hollywood for most of my career, and we were constantly sold the hero's journey. It was the drumbeat of the only kinds of stories we were supposedly allowed to tell, even though there were plenty of hit movies all around the world that were heroines' journeys. So today we're going to go into what is a heroine's journey. And the only person in the whole world you want to do that with is Gail Carriger. So welcome. Please explain how you came up with the heroine's journey.
It's not me, I swear. It's lots of others. A long time ago, really. I am an archaeologist by training, and archaeologist in the United States is an interdisciplinary practice, and I was a classical archaeologist in undergraduate. And so I was taking a lot of courses with the classics department, and because of my hobby and interest in writing, shall we say, at the time, because I was a very serious archaeologist, I was particularly interested in the mythology. I am being facetious. I'm a ceramicist by training, and if you study the classics, then you study mythology because it shows up on the pottery a lot. A lot. So it's really helpful if you're analyzing black figure or red figure or whatever to know the gods that you're looking at, or the heroes on these pots. So I took mythology, I took a lot of gender and mythology in particular, and we were taught the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell, but we were also taught the heroine's journey. And we studied Nagy's translation of the Demeter myth, amongst others, during that. And I got very interested in it, and so I worked at the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum in San Jose, so I've always been very interested in Egyptian stuff and Egyptian mythology, and so I started seeing all of these parallels, and I was like, well, obviously this is very similar to the hero's journey, but it's its own thing. And then I just went on with life. I was like, okay, all right, everybody knows there are two of these, we go on. And it turns out once I stopped being an archaeologist and became a full-time author and was doing a lot of talking heads on panels and stuff, that I would casually mention the heroine's journey whenever the hero's journey came up, because I was like, well, there's another version. There's a different way, you guys, we can write these things. And someone in the audience would inevitably raise their hands and be like, I have never heard of it, and now you have to explain it. And I'd be like, I cannot do that in 5 minutes. beats on a panel. I just thought everybody knew about it. And so I was waiting for somebody. Murdoch has written a sort of Jungian version of the heroine's journey, and there have been some, but that's really a feminist rebuttal to Campbell. And it's more about sort of self-actualization. And I was like, well, what we really need is sort of just a Beats version of this, like Save the Cat or anything else. Like we as writers use the hero's journey. I was like, we just need a heroine's journey version of that. And I was waiting for somebody to write it. And then eventually I just got tired. I basically was like, I'm tired of having to tell people to pin me down and talk to me after hours in order to explain this to them. And so I put together a long version of the teaching deck, and then I was like, well, not everybody has hours, all day on a Sunday to learn about this thing, but it's really hard to squeeze it in. So I did a short version of it, but the short version really isn't thorough enough, and then there's too many questions whenever I give the short version. So finally I was like, well, she who spots the problem is responsible for the solution, as my mother is fond of saying. And also I have another saying I really love, which is move in the direction of greatest courage. And I was like, well, I'm really scared about writing nonfiction. I've been called to write this, so I wrote it. So that is how it came to be.
What I love, though, about your heroine's journey is that you say it's different, but your fiction has a lightness. I'll even use in the positive way snark. It's delightful and funny, and so's this nonfiction book on writing structure. Like that's what's so fantastic about it. It's an utterly delicious read.
You could tell by your personality, your vocal tones, your presentation. You seem like the kind of person people would want to hang out with. There's a sassiness to your delivery of things, I guess. And I'm sassy too, but we're each sassy in our own way.
As we're talking to writers here, that is intentional. I did think about writing two versions of it. One version which would go to an academic press, and the other version which would go popular. And one of the reasons I was in a near constant pitch battle with my own academic field when I was writing white papers and that sort of thing as an academic was that in order to be taken seriously, I had to be really, really dry. And I'm like, but I'm a good writer. I was like, I like to write. Like, I can make this information, which in archaeology is storytelling. I was like, I can make this really exciting and interesting. Like, I could make this fun for you to read.
Is there an allegory to that in mythology where the uptight world tries to boringitize the super creative artist?
I don't know. It is a lesson that can be unpacked within the heroine's journey itself, which is one of the reasons for the chronic disenfranchisement of it is that it's very useful in comedic writing in particular, and comedic writing by its nature is not taken seriously, much as romance is not taken seriously. And in academia, if you're in a weird way too good a writer, Mary Roach, for example, is a great example of a nonfiction author who's just a great writer.
Love her.
But then the academic world won't take you seriously.
In the science is the same. If you're fun, then you can't be serious. But then, of course, nobody wants to watch or read your shit if you're too boring. So that stays in a dusty bookshelf with nobody having read it.
And it's really hard because, as I would complain at the time, I'm getting public grant money to do this research. Therefore, shouldn't I be writing something that is consumable by the general public? Like, shouldn't the knowledge that essentially I am being paid to germinate, shouldn't that be something that is palatable to laymen?
So I used to work at NASA, and I had that exact same fight. I'm like, this is government dollars. We should create content that's accessible to everybody. And they were like, only the top 10% of the intellectual population is everybody. And I was like, what? Literally, we're the same on opposite ends.
Yeah, it was frustrating. And so my eventual decision with this book, to bring it back around, is that I decided to specifically to self-publish it, not because I did not have offers on the table from presses, but because I wanted it to be fun to read. And then when I wrote it, and you guys clearly picked up on this, I actually dictated it as if I were giving the presentation. And so that's the tone of voice you're picking up on is exactly my tone of voice. I also chose a narrator who knew me personally and who spoke a little bit like I did. So though the woman who narrates this book sounds a little bit the way I do, I wanted it to be something that was fun to read. And I also wanted it in a meta way to kind of demonstrate what I was trying to talk about and unpack within its pages, which is that things that are wildly popular and fun and engaging have a propensity not to be taken seriously by critics for various reasons, not the least of which is the gender and inclination of those critics over the years.
Wow, that's hardcore.
I think it's time to tell the audience, what is the heroine's journey?
Well, this is the part where I'm like, I did have to write a book about it because it is a lot. But essentially, it is a little bit like the hero's journey in fundamentals, but not in application, shall we say. The heroine is usually in a position of power at the beginning of her narrative or just before the start of her narrative, and something precious is taken from her that is almost always a familial network of some kind. So a friend, a daughter, a mother, a child, a partner. And that causes her to commence what I call the search. So in the hero's journey, this would be the withdrawal and the crossing of the threshold. But in the heroine's journey, it's the search, because the heroine is usually looking for something. And then on her search, and this is a key difference to the heroine is aided. And she is aided by agents of trust, people who she can rely on. This, again, can usually be a member of a sibling, a family network, like a sibling, a sister is very common. And these people will come to her with information or help, or physical ability help sometimes, which will aid her but not necessarily find or solve the problem for her. And so she will continue her search. This search takes her to a version of the underground that we see in the hero's journey as well. Usually the heroine is more likely to engage in subversive activities, so she will often disguise herself. She will hide her abilities in some way. And again, she will continue to network or try to network and reform family networks throughout it. And her strength and her capacity is in this ability to pull people into her network with her, that sometimes we will form a group and we will continue on this journey together. Sometimes they will give her information that she can then act on. And eventually she will find what she is looking for, whether that is in actuality or is in mental or emotional finding. So she will find a new family if her original family is no more, for example. And then she will compromise in order to make sure that that family can be together again, or with her. And it's the act of compromise at the end of the narrative that also will have a beneficial impact on those around her, either her country or her city or her town, or in some cases the whole world or the whole universe, depending on what kind of narrative you're. And that's okay. And the Demeter myth is sort of classic version of this. Persephone is taken. Demeter searches for her. Demeter is aided by her sister. She visits the underworld, or the proverbial underworld in her case. She walks the world of man. She attempts to reunify by creating new family networks, and eventually she negotiates for the reunion with Persephone, and that results in the seasons, among other things, and in humans learning agriculture and various other things. And so there are various versions of this myth in lots of different places. In the book, I use Isis from ancient Egypt, and then I use Inanna from ancient Persia, or Ishtar, as two other examples, but there are quite a few more. And then we see a version of this myth turn up constantly from ancient Greek times through Roman times, and then all the way up through till it gets grabbed onto, specifically for the Western world during the Victorian era, the mid to late Victorian era, and the rise of industrialization, partly because literacy spikes and we have a rising middle class and women who are educated and who can read and who have leisure time. And so you get a big surge in this kind of narrative being written and consumed.
Can you give us an example of one that came around then that maybe people would have heard of, that's a retelling of this?
For sure. Authors like Radcliffe, for example, or Anne Radcliffe is very, I mean, I would call her very well known, but you could put Jane Austen's, most romances will fall into this category if you think about it, because they are essentially narratives of union. The whole story is about uniting with another person or persons. One of the things that we saw rise in the Victorian era was the rise of the Romantic Gothics. And from the Romantic Gothics of that time period, we get most of genre fiction. And so a lot of genre fiction, specifically romance, but like about half of science fiction and fantasy, for example, a lot of cozy mysteries as well, are all based, whether writers realize it or not, on the heroine's journey.
So interesting. Is it always a happy ending?
Generally speaking, yes. There can be
Wow.
such a thing as a tragic heroine's journey, but readers of the heroine's journey narrative prefer a happy ending. And that happy ending is defined by romance as a specific thing, but it is also defined by cozy mysteries as a specific thing. A happy ending in a cozy mystery is the partners, who are, it's almost always two people, right, solving the mystery. They stay together, they stay friends, and they solve the mystery. And that's the happy ending under the context of that genre. So the genres have different definitions of what happy means to them. But generally speaking, yes, readers of the heroine's journey do expect a satisfying ending of a kind that like solves for the problem that they're reading about. They don't like pathos. So if you want to write a
Well, who does?
if you want to write a tragic heroine's journey, you can. You just have to make sure as a writer that you seed it properly and you don't betray your readers' expectations on the matter. So make sure that it's well foreshadowed, I would say.
One of the things about the heroine's journey that really hit me between the eyes was when I took your class, was formulating this idea behind the new mythos. And there are a number of aspects in stories that I see now as extremely new mythic. And there are things that are plucked right out of the heroine's journey. So the idea of asking for help, that the main character has a sense of vulnerability and also a recognition that they can't do it alone. The idea of a group working together to accomplish a goal, that no one can accomplish a goal by themselves. There is no savior coming for us. There is no chosen one. We are all in it together and working together to do this thing. Also, the idea that change occurs. And one of the gripes I've always had about the hero's journey, and especially when it was utilized in the superhero genre, was that it always returned after this big cycle back to the status quo. You know, the villains are vanquished and the superhero returns Gotham or Metropolis back to whatever it was before it started, minus the incredible destruction that had been wreaked, you know, during the vanquishing. That's just not real. That's utterly unrealistic.
Utterly.
Life is about change and about encountering obstacles, negotiating, compromising, and figuring out what the new world looks like on the other end. And to me, the heroine's journey was always a reflection of where we needed to go in stories, because it actually reflects not just the real world, but seeds the expectations that people have and how they live their lives. And since stories are just about problem solving, and these myths are ultimately about helping us look at the world in a way that allows us to figure out how to deal with it and go on, Heroine's Journey just made all the sense in the world to me. And let's face it, some of the most iconic stories, like The Wizard of Oz, could not be more Heroine's Journey. I mean, it maps perfectly.
I use this example because everybody has read it or watched it, and I use Harry Potter, acknowledging the challenges that come with having utilized that narrative now. I mean, it's so literal. Harry, he literally, every time he's alone, he's in more danger than when one of his friends shows up. Like, even if you just unpack the first book, he has this quest he goes on to visit the underworld. Obviously, it's guarded by a three-headed dog, and he cannot solve the problems without his two friends. There's no way he's going to make it to that Sorcerer's Stone without his friends. And also, the stone, the boon, is not the point of that book either. It's the information that Harry will eventually learn about how he is the way he is from Dumbledore. That's the point. The point is the information gathering and the explanation of family, right? That first book is a classic heroine's journey. The whole series is a classic heroine's journey. And it really hit the zeitgeist. Many of our incredibly popular narratives, not just in books, but also on the silver screen and in various series and things like that. One of my favorite of all time is the series Leverage, which capers are often sort of classic heroine's journeys because there's a sort of de facto leader, but they can't accomplish their ends if they don't have the skill sets of all of the parties involved.
Exactly.
It's the whole point. of the narrative is like coming together to undermine the man, but the coming together is part of it. And what addicts people to watching those shows is the dynamic of that family. NCIS, for example, Law and Order, some of these incredibly long-running things. What people are watching for is the character connections, and that they're watching that family be built and pulled together.
Oh gosh, now I can think of so many shows like that. Yeah,
exactly.
No, which goes to show you're explaining it well.
I always say that the heroines, some of the heroines' characteristics include, one way to think of her is as, again, first, she can be a male or female or non-binary. I'm going to use her just because we talk about that as a heroine, but that this character can be any gender. The way she marshals her, and I use that term not injudiciously, is a little bit like she's like a general. She's really good at seeing usually the strengths and weaknesses in everybody around her, and so she knows when best to utilize and activate. And so a heroine, for example, doesn't often like pick up a sword and fight her own battles for herself. That she instead finds the person who's best at the sword and then recruits him to her side and then sicks them at it, right? And to your point, PJ, the idea is that the act of asking for help is actually her greatest strength. Exactly. Or one of her greatest strengths. And that is incredibly challenging to get across, particularly in the United States and particularly in individualistic societies where we have been taught self-reliance as this sort of noble achievement.
I call it toxic individualism. What you're saying, I think, is that the quality of being able to gather help is actually a superpower in itself.
And to know what the best help is for the different situations, and also to know what you're good at and what you're not so good at. Like, self-knowledge is part of this equation. The heroine is like, well, I am good at these things, and sometimes that self-knowledge, when you're writing a sword and sorcery style fantasy novel, that it can be like putting together the travel group with the sorceress and the rogue and the thief and the da, right? So sometimes that knowledge is somewhat superficial, but sometimes it's quite deep in terms of like, I'm maybe not so great at being the person you're going to have this emotional conversation about your breakup, but like, you should call Rachel, right? Like, don't talk to me, but talk to Rachel about this. Like, she'll help out, right? That is also a heroine superpower, is knowing when people come to her to help, whether she's the right one or whether, you know, she has a vast network to call on that she can then move the chess pieces around a little bit.
When I wrote my trilogy, science fiction, near-term techno-thriller trilogy, I started with the hero's journey because it's what I knew coming out of Hollywood. But the book kept on insisting it was turning into a heroine's journey. And by the third book, it was full on new mythos, heroine's journey. It couldn't help itself, because ultimately when you're dealing with any concepts of complexity, and so many of these quests are actually issues of complexity. Like, you think you're going after this to solve this, but it turns into these. The obstacles increase. That's why you need specialists. You need your leverage team. You need your whatever that group is with each of their individual skills to solve these very complex problems that one person can't do. And it's utterly ludicrous storytelling to assume that they can.
And it's not connected to real life. I mean, literally, even in this very moment of this podcast, I'm relying on you, PJ.
Well, and we're relying on you to edit this out the other side to make us all sound more intelligent.
Are there stories that are both a hero and heroine's journey?
I think there can be. I mean, it gets increasingly complicated. There are so many similarities between the two. I'm not surprised to hear that you started writing a heroes that sort of came into a heroines, because they can evolve that way. And you can also think of what happens if you put a hero who thinks, acts, and talks like a hero into a heroine's journey. Like, usually it goes one of two ways. She will try to incorporate him and sort of like convert him to her version of the mythos, or he will become a villain under the context of that story, because her narrative, the heroine's narrative, sees somebody that individualistic and that prone to striking out on his own and to picking up the sword first, so metaphorically or actuality, as an enemy. But you can also then realize that if you're writing one of these narratives, a great villain is somebody who's constantly trying to isolate the heroine from her companions, trying to take her away from her companions, trying to kill off her companions, trying to kidnap her, those sorts of things. Those make very good villains under the context of the heroine's journey, because it's like the polar opposite of her and what she wants from this narrative and what the narrative wants from her. I would argue that there are some, say, epic fantasy authors, multiple POV authors, who are writing various different characters on different versions of the journey. So like the Game of Thrones books, for example, you can argue, especially when they were translated into the TV, we don't know how the whole thing is going to end, but that Arya Stark is on a hero's journey, but that Sansa Stark is on a heroine's journey, and so on and so forth. Like, you could go through all the different characters and try and see some of them are tragic heroes, some of them are tragic heroines, so on and so forth.
So interesting.
Often you have to, like, let it play out. It gets so complicated. You're like, you know, the ending makes a big difference in these. Like, if the character ends up alone or somewhat alone and isolated, if you get an ending shot of that person standing by themselves staring off to the sunset off the deck of a ship, then they were probably on a hero's journey, right? If they've lost everybody they loved, if all of their mentors have been killed, then probably a hero's journey. But the narrative still perceives them as the victorious end of the story, as pathos as it could be, that's usually a hero. But if they end up like with their children again, or with their family again, or with their lover, or married, or whatever it is, in an act of unity is what I call it in the book, they were probably on a heroine's journey.
Don't roll your eyes when I say this word. You can roll your eyes if you want to. Sorry. The Odyssey, which is coming out in theaters.
The eyes are rolling. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. At first I said don't roll your eyes, and then I was like, they're going to roll their eyes. I shouldn't tell them what to do. But, I mean, the Odyssey seems like it's very much a hero's journey, but in the end, he goes together and he gets his wife back.
Yeah. Here's the thing. There's another factor going on here, which is not everything falls into one of these two, right? Yeah. Like, there are lots of different narratives out there. Like, heaven forfend you try and slam a 4-act structure out of Japan or a 6-act out of China into one of these. It's just not going to work. That's not how narrative is conceived. There are elements of this that you can look for, but I always caution, like, the black and white nature of humans love to be prescriptive, and like I just like it doesn't have to. I don't know where I would fall on the Odyssey, which makes me think it's probably a hero's journey.
It seems hero journey-y because it's about the one dude mostly, and you know he's
and he kills everything all the time. He's always killing
everything.
Everybody dies.
He does it himself all the time. But then he gets his wife back in the end.
The point of the narrative, though, is he doesn't need anybody, including her. She's, as Campbell puts it, the end of the journey, his journey. There's this horrible quote, which is attributed to Campbell, I should say. There was no like evidence that he actually said it on record, but that women don't need to undertake the journey because they are the journey's end, basically.
God. Let's strike that myth down, okay?
He was of his time.
That's no excuse. I'm sorry. Too many people use that as an excuse.
But it is worth like thinking about that under the context of the hero's journey, especially in the ancient Greek times, and their treatment and objectification and view of women's, particularly in the wife role in Greek culture. Yes, he does reunite with her, but at what cost? He's literally lost everybody. He lost all of his companions on the ship, and he has to wholesale slaughter all of her suitors,
all of her friends.
So my feeling is that it is a hero's journey. It's just that the pathos isn't as dwelled upon as it is with, say, Heracles or Perseus or any of the others you could name who end up very tragic.
One of the things that we talk about here is this sedimentary nature of mythology. So where you can see these ancient myths, they didn't go away with each of the turnovers of new mythi that occurred when technologies changed and storytelling changed, these certain periods of time in human history. Instead, they got shifted and they got turned over and re-examined in light of this, whatever the new culture was. So for instance, if you had Prometheus in ancient Greece as this, you know, the god who gave us fire, and he's punished, it got turned over during the Enlightenment, which is the next big changeover, to Frankenstein. So the modern Prometheus is literally the subtitle of the story, where we get to see maybe it was a bad idea that an irresponsible creator created a new man. As I call it, the deadbeat dad whose, rampaging child punishes him and everyone else. Because you don't blame the child, you blame the dad. And then again, in the 20th century, so much science fiction was Promethean. It was insane.
This is very interesting. I'm going to interrupt you. I'm so sorry.
Please.
Because you've put your finger on something that I think it's really important for people to know that also happened during that time period I talked about before, which is the Industrial Revolution, which is, on the whole, in the Western world at least, partly as a result of Enlightenment, but the sort of ultimate consequences of Enlightenment, which was the Industrial Revolution, is this idea that we move from what in most of prior human narrative history was gods, and specifically like the devil or the afterworld or demons as the negative, to this concept that mankind's own hubris could create a negative thing.
Correct.
And that was a relatively novel idea
Right.
at that moment. This idea that science itself also has within it the capacity to be feared. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is another example of that. Science fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, modern literary traditions have all been unpacking that idea ever since. And the theological nature of dialogue with the devil has sort of been wholesale forgotten about, except in certain arenas of horror, for example. Under the context of narrative, specifically fictional narrative, we've been grappling with, is technology enemy or is technology solution, sort of ever since the Industrial Revolution.
Especially right this very
yeah.
moment in time.
Sure, always, yeah. And it's so much a grappling that we grapple with it since the Luddites. We've grappled with it as a culture as well. This idea that a new technology is introduced. So I used to be a technologist. That's what my archaeological focus was, specifically on technological innovation. So this is something I'm super passionate about. It's this idea that, first of all, when a new technology is introduced in humans, it's almost always whimsically introduced. We're creatures of play first. Mm-hmm. So when we get gunpowder, we do fireworks, right? And then we get destructive with it. When we found and invented plastic, it was lucite, it was jewelry that we played with. The same thing with aluminium or aluminum. So you get this idea that technology is something exciting and interesting, and then it becomes something destructive or gruesome or destructive of the environment. And so then you get this idea that we regard technology when it's newly introduced, AI, for example, as something scary. That then has to be attacked or grappled with, or whatever. And I'm not making an argument any direction, because I think that most technologies can be used for good or ill. But it's very interesting that we have been having this dialogue specifically within the fictional world for hundreds of years now.
And it's very much why this podcast exists, because my theory with the new Mythos is that in the last century, but mostly the last 50 years, we've been telling different kinds of stories because we're recognizing that we're through this new technological paradigm shift. And we're grappling with, what does it mean? Who are we? What's our relationship with each other and the world and the cosmos? And it's changing everything. In that way it did in the Enlightenment, and in that way it did in the Axial Age, that first millennia BCE, where everybody went, holy cow, we're all together in cities, and what do we do with the stranger?
You were talking about stratification and layers and sedimentation of storytelling.
Thank you. So I'm curious, do you see a myth from the heroine's journey that you see specifically applicable today? Or have you seen stories where you've gone, that's a great adaptation of this? It could be your own work.
No, I wouldn't self-aggrandize like that. But this is wildly interesting to me because of a side little short story project that I'm like quasi working on. I don't know if it's going to happen or not, but I was noodling on it. There's been a resurgence and fascination with the Greek gods in particular, but specifically Hades and Persephone for some reason, who are like, really? You pick the rapist? Great.
Yeah.
Well, of course, obviously, we need to heal from these stories by telling it over and over again.
But they're glorifying it, and I'm like, well, that's a wild choice. We went to the Greeks, like the Greek gods, the most capricious. Basically, they're all like frickin' frat boys and teenagers, and you're like, the Greek gods were your choice. You went to them. 2020, did you? Okay. I mean, I'm sure there's some sort of psychological explanation for it. But I did like perk up and notice. I always notice when like the zeitgeist becomes obsessed with some sort of ancient component of myth. I mean, I blame Madeline Miller a little bit for that. Like Miller wrote her 2 books, and then suddenly Circe in particular, and then everybody was like, oh, Greek myths.
I liked Circe. It was good.
It's great, a feminist retelling, but it sparked a bunch of stuff in at least amongst authors and amongst publishers' acquisitions.
Because that sold so well, then everybody started to repeat the same thing, maybe perhaps not as well.
Or just, it's just an interesting obsession to watch happen amongst a genre circle, for example. I mean, I have private theories on the nature of like what we fear at different times in history and what will sell as a result of that. Like, I think during times where people fear mob rule or collectivism, for example, zombies tend to be on the rise.
Yes.
And then when people are in fear of totalitarian regimes or monarchical governments or tyranny, then vampires tend to be on the rise.
Exactly.
Wait, that is fucking cool. That is so interesting. Why? Like, why vampires?
Well, vampires represent aristocratic elites. That's what they are.
And literally blood-sucking.
And literally blood-sucking the poor, right? They're the CEO billionaire of the romance novel.
So it's just basically a parallel. We're paralleling with our stories what's happening in our world, whether
Always.
we're doing it on purpose or subconsciously.
Storytelling is a way to try to unpack what's going on in our reality or escape it or both.
Is there another one? So we got zombies and
Vampires.
Vampires. What are?
Well, there's werewolves. I don't know where the shapeshifting contingent falls in.
I don't either.
They're
because
coming next. You heard it first.
They tend to be allied with this idea of the appeal of nature and the appeal of becoming a different self. So there's
Yes.
an ego-id thing going on. So
right.
there's a extreme escapism to werewolf and shapeshifting fiction, I think. That's not the same as vampires or zombies.
Also the release of the id, the release of the animal, the release of, I mean, you could even say like Incredible Hulk is part of werewolf mythology. An uncontrollable id urge to, become a destructive force.
The metamorphosis myth from way back then, there's plenty of them. Although the ancient Greeks, of course, like to use it to seduce people, especially Zeus. There's a lot of interesting things around monstrosity and the nature of monstrosity and what we read and find popular. Some Greek monsters have been completely abandoned to the annals of history, while others, say Pegasus, for example, never dies, like has lived on eternal. So that's also interesting to me.
So I wrote on Hercules and Xena. So we had a ball digging out the old myths. Echidna? Who's Echidna? We're going to write an Echidna.
That is so cool. So Hercules, or Heracles, depending on how you would like to pronounce it, was one of my favorites, and I wrote one of my theses as an undergraduate on Hercules as an extreme hero, like as a version of the hero on the hero's journey, but like the most elevated version because he has to do it 12 times, right? He's got 12 labors, and then he's still burned by a lady. Yeah, he's so very much a hero. He's one of my favorites because of that. I always like seeing him turn up.
With the hero's journey and the selling of the hero's journey, whether it's selling in Hollywood or publishing or even in things like business and how we frame just being in the world as individuals. The heroine's journey keeps on getting forgotten, even though there is many examples of successful examples of the heroine's journey. Why do you think that is?
This goes back to this sort of origin of when it started to become really increasingly popular as a commodity, as a consumable narrative, which was, again, I keep going to the Victorian era. Basically, it was critically enfranchised from the get-go because primarily the myth was written by women for women readers, and the male critics of the day just disregarded it as sadly popular.
Sadly popular.
Sadly popular.
That's so bizarre.
It was just abused basically in the press. They're like, well, nobody wants that. I mean, you can look up a famous Victorian author named Marie Corelli. She outsold like Kipling, Conan Doyle, like all of the male authors of the time, like all of them together. She outsold them. And yet we've totally forgotten about her. And she was just a prolific writer of basically occult romances with a religious bent to them. Hugely popular in her day. She was like Queen Victoria's favorite author, amongst others. And we just don't really know about her because she was just ignored by the critics.
So it's basically some form of misogyny then.
Yeah, it's misogyny. Sorry.
Or
To put
is
it in a
garden
short
variety
way.
misogyny?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I always like to slow clap at cocktail parties and congratulate whoever's come up to me to complain about the latest romance novel on participating in 200 years of misogyny. It's so creative and novel and inventive of them. I'm always like going to try to educate. It's like I can change their minds.
You should.
And don't you feel like the Victorians just have so much to answer for? so much to answer for.
So much to answer for. Really, they really do. They set us up on a long path of real problematic politics, borders, like you name it.
A lot of the storytelling things we discuss on this podcast aren't meant for just writers of fiction. They're meant for all kinds of storytellers. Do you have a sense of the power of the heroine's journey for people who aren't just telling a fictional story? I can tell you that I've talked to many people who are not fictional storytellers, and when I tell them about the heroine's journey, they get incredibly excited, and this includes male business leaders because they understand the truth behind it. I'd love to hear if you have a sense of how it applies outside of the realm of writing fiction.
My sphere is in literature. Like, the way I argued myself into writing this book at all was like to persuade myself that I was just talking to other authors and it would be fine. I mean, it is meant for readers as well, and authors of all things, screens, whatever. I'm not an expert outside of that sphere, but I will say I've had a lot of people come to me. So gaming designers, which I actually really was hoping it would get to. I was like, please, game designers, learn about the heroine's journey.
Dungeons and Dragons is a heroine's journey. That's
absolutely.
like
role-playing,
certainly. And a lot of the community collectivist games that we got with the mobile devices are kind of more heroine's journeys. But I was thinking about like some of the RPGs and things like that. I was like, it's time, like World of Warcraft or whatever should really have leaned into that to make it like part of success in the game to put your team together correctly and that sort of thing.
Interesting.
In my humble opinion.
There's still a chance. There's more games
Still a
being
chance.
made.
There's still a chance.
Get
Yes,
out
absolutely.
there, gamers.
I have heard from people who are like, I work in a game and we're reading your book, or it's gone into academic institutions, which I'm super excited about. And I have had some people reach out to me. Like, I had a exercise guru type reach out to me to be like, yes, I'm going to start using this. I'm going to start buddying people up to get them to, and I was like, well,
that's
yeah,
a great
of course.
idea. Yeah.
You want to go for a walk every day. It's a lot easier if you're like joining somebody else to go on that walk or go to the gym, because then you feed off each other and you push each other and you have to show up for somebody as external forces.
Well, wouldn't a sports team, you even have a designated role? You're the forward, you're the defense, you're the guard.
And I think you can have issues and concerns, which we have seen with sports teams, again, not my sphere, if one of them is too much the hero. Like if you have a too much of a superstar on a team, that can sometimes be to the deficit of that team.
Or they say that the superstar is the one who passes the ball the best.
I'm incredibly impressed that you've been able to synthesize mythology, ancient mythology, into your life. Because I think a lot of people don't understand how grounded we are in it. They take it for granted. They live in the soup of stories, and they don't see the stories for what they are and how they're influencing us. And I just want to thank you. Do you sense that in yourself? Do you feel like you walk through the world and you just see these ancient stories?
Maybe a little bit. I mean, it is my training. I've always been a lover of mythology. You know, I like many kids, had an obsession with the ancient Egyptians in particular. So I've always been obsessed with them. I love and was taken to a lot of museums and galleries and things like that. I was very enmeshed in an artist community growing up. And to understand, you know, the Renaissance masters, for example, you have to know your mythology. You can't, go see a Titian and not understand the seduction of Leda, right? I love Shakespeare. Most of Shakespeare's plays, you can't really comprehend them if you don't have at least a basic understanding of Greek and Roman mythology. It was part of my upbringing. My parents consciously raised me atheist, or at least agnostic, but they made sure that I was very well grounded in all of the world religions and ancient mythologies as sort of a side impact of that, or as much as they could. I should say I'm now learning about Thai mythology, for example.
So earlier you were saying how you saw the Demeter myth all over, and
Yeah.
it's kind of obvious why the rapey myth is happening. But if you had your choice of the goddess myths, and I'm asking that selfishly because I want to walk away from this with a story that I can think about for the rest of the afternoon.
I feel like the Elysian mysteries are very interesting. Like Artemis of Ephesus is a goddess that or Ephesus is a goddess that I think is like very understudied. And I did quite a bit of study into how the Greek goddesses were evolved by the Romans, expanded out through the Roman Empire, and then like reabsorbing the local mythoses around goddesses in particular. But what I would, I guess, urge everybody to think about and focus on is something that really just occurred to me, and this is not in the book, which is the key players of power of the feminine and of the gendered woman in the mythological sphere. The ones that are important are given names. If you're interested in looking into ancient goddesses and other cultures and stuff, like look for the named ones. The angry, many-armed goddesses of the Indian mythology.
Durga's my favorite.
Durga's literally my favorite.
Look at the Valkyries that are given named too. The storm goddesses of the Valkyrie, who were probably local goddesses that were absorbed into this pantheon. That's, I think, where the sort of interesting forgotten ones lie, that are kind of worth, for me now, kind of worth pursuing.
Is there one that you're like particularly engaged with now that you could just tell us for 2 minutes a little bit about?
Right now there are two. I call her Rota. I can't remember what her proper Norse name is. She's a storm goddess Valkyrie character, and then I'm turning her into a character, but she's a mythological Valkyrie, and this is why I mentioned it. And another one is Menorah, who is a Kinneri female goddess with the bottom half of her is a swan and the top half is a beautiful woman. And they are goddesses. They're muse-style goddesses in that they are very singers and dancers and performers.
Where's Menorah from?
She's Thai. This is a Thai goddess. There's very interesting mythology around the Kinneri. And those are myths that are quite alive and fresh in that part of the world because they're depicted on all of the wats and the temples in the area, and that part of the world you still visit temples and you still go regularly, and so you still see that imagery, and that's part of what keeps the myths alive in different ways in different parts of the world, is how much visual input they're having in your day-to-day existence, as well as whether writers are picking up and utilizing them in new fiction, in whatever form, in actuality or in rewritten or in illusion. So, I mean, I think art, we didn't really touch on it because this is a podcast about story and fiction, but I think art has a really key role to play in this as well, in terms of how we remember and keep different myths alive in our own zeitgeist and cultures.
Myths apply to every form of communication, music, visual
Yes.
arts,
Yeah.
all of it.
Dance, you said the dancing duck goddess, the dancing swan.
Yes, think about the ballets that are still performed
Yeah,
to this day.
dancing swans.
Or the operas, the symphonies. Yeah,
Yeah.
all of these things tie back. And the same with the sort of music and dance of other cultures in other parts of the world. They're doing the same thing with their own myths. And then the other thing is that, like, you know, borders are also an artificial construct, that these myths transcend and move between places and spaces as well, and they have always done so, just the same way humans do throughout history. I'm very interested in the kitsune, the fox shifting spirits. A gumiho is also a fox shifting spirit. Like, they show up throughout all different parts of Asia, and how the different cultures would call them and treat them and fold them into their storytelling structures is absolutely fascinating. But there are these tendrils, though, and I guess to go back to your original question of whether I do like patterns, I do like to spot patterns. I think it's trained into me from my archaeology days, and I am always interested in these patterns that seem to transcend culture, that seem to move between the boundaries of things, whether it's the fact that almost every culture in the world, at least every one that I've encountered, has some form of shape-shifting creature as part of their mythology, and some form of carrion or blood-sucking creature as part of it. The werewolf and the vampire in a form is everywhere.
And you even said the half human, half animal creature.
Very
seems
common
to
as well,
be-
yeah. Less popular in modern narratives, I will say.
I don't know. I wonder if I could be a half something, what would I want my lower half to be?
Mermaid, no question.
Oh, yeah?
Easy
Okay.
answer.
Yeah.
So you've thought about this before. Are you also a mermaid, PJ?
Actually, I think I'd be a bird.
Yeah,
Oh,
bird,
one's fly.
bird or
I want to
fish.
fly. Yeah.
Yeah.
wanna
Well,
fly.
I want to be a ring-tailed lemur on the bottom.
The Vinara, there are monkey shapeshifter characters out of India in particular. There's lots of monkey gods, so
Yeah, yeah, of course. Hanuman.
Well, Gail, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. I hope that our listeners have gone on a mythological journey with us. I also am thrilled because we're doing a season of this show and you are our last episode to kind of tie it all up in a nice bow so that everyone understands that this idea of mythology just continues evolving and changing, and we have the ability to utilize it in all kinds of very constructive ways.
and magical ways.
And magical ways.
Yeah, be the vanguard of narrative in whatever form that takes.
Well, you have, so.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Love Letters to the Future. This has been PJ Manny with
Laura Faye Tenenbaum, thank you guys so much for
Thank
listening.
you so much. Take care.